Collage Paper 75 is part 1 of 2. I'm going to do 2 simple double layer pulls using, for my first time, an artificial flower to show you how to get a similar effect 2 ways. The first way is a single pull. I started with a thin layer of Liquitex Basics Deep Violet and Payne's Gray and made 2 impressions of my flower. When you are doing a single pull, you're working from the top down. This will be my top layer. I probably shouldn't have pushed the flower down quite so hard to have left more definition, but this will be interesting still. After that layer is totally dry, I add my pull layer, cadmium yellow light hue and cadmium red light hue, which, as I said last week, looks orange to me, using my smallest sprayer to make sure I have defined color left. The paint is a little thick, but should be okay. Cardstock for the pull, and this also needs to dry. This was not a perfect pull. I lost a couple of spots that may not have been thoroughly dry, but it's an interesting look. That would have perhaps been more interesting if I had more definition in the flowers, but you get the idea. And next I'll show you another approach to get the same basic look with its own feel. After cleaning the bits of paint that were left from Collage Paper 75, yes, baby wipes are great for cleaning off your gel plate. Collage Paper 76 will start with the background. Again, we're doing 2 layers, but instead of a single pull, I will be pulling them separately. So working from the bottom up. So instead of starting with the deep violet and Payne's Gray like last night, I start with the cadmium yellow light hue and the cadmium red light hue. Yes, I still think it's orange. Placing it in areas similar to Collage Paper 75 in the areas where I want to have my flowers. Being mindful to clean off my brayer so I don't blend the colors too much. I'm concerned the paint is a little too thick, but I go with it. Unlike the single pull, there's no need to wait for this layer to dry before pulling it. On the same cardstock as Collage Paper 75, I did not think getting a Baron would be this big of a deal. Wow, I thought it was kind of unnecessary, but it turned out to be a great birthday present. All right, yes, too much paint, which does allow for a pull on tissue paper. This is not my favorite tissue paper, and I shouldn't have rubbed so hard there. Also, this print will look more different from the last print than it would if I had gotten closer to equal amounts of paint. And I still had paint. Dry enough to pull with a layer of gloss medium, which will have to dry. One of the advantages you may have noticed of doing this type of pull instead of a single pull is not needing to wait for layers to dry. But I hate wasting paint, and I knew this would look interesting, so drying time. And yes, more than there would have been if I hadn't used too much gloss medium. Before being able to move on to the second layer, which is the top layer, back to the Liquitex Basics Deep Violet and Payne's Gray. A little too thick, so as you can see the distinct lines between the colors. I don't want to leave it too much like that since it would be too different from part 1. So what it comes down to is the biggest differences between the 2 prints are in part because of my applying the paint differently, making my impressions of the flower in about the same places and lining my paper up relatively well. That is one of the benefits of a single pull, not having to be concerned about lining anything up. But back to this technique, didn't have to wait for anything to dry. This was not a perfect pull. And as mentioned, the biggest differences between Collage Papers 75 and 76 are largely due to different applications of paint. You will get some different texture though by doing them these 2 different ways. Some fun roll-off sheets and the excess paint pull with gloss medium as well as the tissue paper, which I like the gloss medium better. I would love to hear if you have an opinion about which technique you'd prefer. So, Collage Paper 77 is a funny story. Maybe. I am doing another single pull, this time with just one image of an artificial flower. And since, as mentioned, It's a single pull. I'm starting with what will be my top layer with Liquitex Basics, Deep Violet, and Payne's Gray. I did a better job with this layer than I did with the last two, Violet and Payne's Gray top layer. Just saying. But also, that being said, you also don't need to see me fiddling around with the tiny brayer at actual speed. So, yeah, sped things up for you. I made the impression of the flower basically the same way as I had in the last two papers. And yes, it's the same flower, but I did try to be more mindful of the center. Well, and the petals also. And this time, I added texture. The modeling paste texture plate from last week was not ideal. It may have worked better if it wasn't warped. And I did have the issue with the edge, which is why I discarded the stencil idea. But I had recently come across some netting that I couldn't remember what it came from, but I had used it in projects before, well, other pieces of it, and perfect timing. I used the little brayer to get it more closely applied, and then I also used the brayer after I turned it over on my roll-off sheet. Adding another layer, so what comes next is, yes, drying time. I really like how this is looking, and I am sticking with the last two papers, cadmium yellow light hue and cadmium red light hue, but also adding back bright aqua green from last week's Play-Doh experiments. I'd wanted the green in sort of smaller areas to do a transparent pull with matte medium, but also thought this was some fun texture with the brayer. And then I moved on to the flower, starting with the red that I see as orange in the center and the yellows. And here is the funny, but not funny. When I started paper 77, my plan was to do a technique I have seen several other people doing on Instagram by painting on the gel plate, particularly within certain shapes, like flowers or characters. But as you can see, I did not use a paintbrush. So, Collage Paper 77 is adding texture to our basic floral pull. On Collage Paper 78, I will be painting my flower. I didn't want to cover the entire plate with my second layer of color, so I had to let it dry to pull with matte medium on cardstock, which, yes, requires more drying time. I had to remove an excess string of plastic acrylic, and I think this came out really cool. I did lose a piece on the plate. It happens sometimes. It may have been still wet. I think this came out pretty cool. And I have two interesting roll-off sheets. Adding texture does add another dimension to our basic pull. And on to Collage Paper 78 and a paintbrush, starting with my Deep Violet and spreading a little so I won't have those weird round spots. Adding my Payne's Gray, which again I say it's kind of like a navy blue almost, after rolling off some excess violet. And again with my reminder that as this will be a single pull, this is the top layer. Speeding up the spreading of the paint and applying my flower. Trying to make sure the center and each of the petals make good contact. I did get my finger in the paint a few times. I will never be the neatest person. I decided to give my flower some friends because it looked kind of lonely there in the middle before I let it dry thoroughly so I could paint it. I had decided to stick with this week's colors, cadmium red light hue, cadmium yellow light hue, and the bright aqua green I had added back in. But with the way I ended up adding flowers, I ended up with no real good place for it. I did want my darker cadmium red light hue, which is, yes, orange, in the centers of my flowers. I didn't get intricate with this. As with the bulk of my other collage papers in this series, my goal is to experiment with new techniques and demonstrate basics. I do intend to come back to the painting idea. For this round, I went from the orange in the center to an orangey yellow to yellow. I had intended to have either the green or orange on the tips of my petals, but then that just didn't feel right as I got there. After everything was thoroughly dry, it was time for the matte medium for the pull. As usual, I got a little much. I again used heavy cardstock for the pull, making sure it was well smoothed down. And again, with a little more medium comes more drying time. But I would say this was worth the wait, both for the learning and for the way it turned out. I love the colors and the texture. A few stray strings of acrylic from getting it a little thick on the edges. And I'm definitely looking forward to doing more with the actual paintbrush texture in the future. Collage Paper 79 became totally different than what I set out to do. The first indication that things weren't going as I planned was getting way too much deep violet on the gel plate right off the bat. Had a brief internal ponder and debate about what to do with it and decided to offload to my larger gel plate, the 8x10. I think I have been neglecting to say this is my 5x7. I know things going differently than I intended or envisioned is not uncommon, but Collage Paper 79 may be the biggest difference between end and intended beginning of this entire series. I even ended up making a small basic tissue paper collage to demonstrate what I love about working with translucent layers. Here I am adding the Payne's Gray as I have every other night of this series so far. I had intended to keep it just in the center because I wanted to just have enough for my flower imprint for ease of adding different texture around it, but that's not how this worked either. I grabbed a piece of paper to pull off the excess paint around the flower, which did not create one of the lovely pulls that can happen when you are using natural or other items as a mask on the gel plate. But the flower imprint I am in love with, and it looks so lusciously translucent. I decided I had to try pulling it on tissue paper. The paint wasn't wet enough for me to try pulling it directly on tissue paper, so I decided to pull it with golden satin glazing liquid, which is what I use as an adhesive in my translucent paper collages. You can thank Maribeth Quinn for that one. It won't get your fingers all sticky. I did let it totally dry, so I wouldn't smear it when I put the medium on it. I did not get my tissue paper on as smoothly as I would have liked. Typically, I would like the lines, but this has more intricate details that should be kept. It quickly became obvious that it would need to dry thoroughly also. So I set it aside to start creating a base for it. I decided to put it on a half sheet of cardstock, which is slightly larger than the plate, and started with a sheet of acrylic writing from earlier in my 100 collage papers, and I will link to that video in the description. I hate straight edges showing in my translucent collage, so I started tearing this. Also, there were spots on this that came out not so great or kind of blobby, and I wanted to keep the writing I used noticeable but not obtrusive. And here is a hack to tear tissue paper along the direction it does not want to be torn. A relatively fine, wet paintbrush. Foil Davies uses a water brush pen. I'm ready to start my base. I realize that putting this on a white background doesn't give you a full effect of the gorgeousness of translucent layers, but I typically start my translucent collages with a base of acrylic writing or lines, or some combination of the two. As mentioned, I use Golden Brand Satin Glazing Liquid as my adhesive. This is the only Golden product I really like. I use a brush to apply, and as well as a layer on the substrate, I put a layer of it over the tissue paper and touch up edges as needed. I don't care about things being super smooth, but I also don't want big wrinkles. I used a bit I tore off the edge at the bottom. After the tissue paper had dried enough, I started the pull, and, well, to be honest, I am disappointed that this is far more opaque than it looked on the gel plate. But I will continue with the layer of pale color on this tissue paper. And I should have noticed already that although when you were holding the tissue paper up, it looked very pale, it is more pigmented than it looks. Tore it down to height, applied the glazing liquid and the tissue paper. And as it becomes saturated and adhered to the paper beneath it and the asemic writing, you can see how gorgeously translucent it is. And this is why I love working with painted tissue paper and other translucent papers. Time to add the flower, tearing it out because, as I mentioned, I don't like any straight edges in this type of collage. And these weren't ideal components, and the flower was not as translucent as it appeared. But I also think this gives you a good representation of why I like working with transparent layers, even if it was totally not what I set out to do with this project. As mentioned, I got way too much deep violet paint for Collage Paper 79 and offloaded it to my larger plate. I also added some texture with the modeling paste texture plate I created in an earlier video. That will be linked in the description. I thought it would be fun to play with texture as I had intended to do in the previous video, but a little differently. Because, as I keep reiterating, in a single pull, the bottom layer on the plate is the top layer on the print. I put down a layer of Payne's Gray to make the prints of the flowers in. So basically, I was thinking lines around the flowers, the lines that created their definition, which is why I went with a dark color, despite the already relatively dark color on the plate. I figured it would look like the flowers were kind of trapped in something, behind something. I at first wasn't sure how much of the dark I wanted to leave and started adding more flowers and kept adding flowers. I thought about adding some other type of texture, but then in the spaces I had left, I had a fun small piece from the artificial flowers also. I think it's pretty cool. Let it dry before I could apply the paint. I switched out the aqua green for brilliant yellow green. Started with my cadmium red light hue orange, vaguely in the center of my flowers, and used the small brayer to soften the edges and start spreading it out. This is looking a little dark for the darker colors that will be above it, but adding the cadmium yellow light hue next. Cleaned off my brayer, thought about adding green, discarded that idea, and spread the yellow. This is definitely going to be an overall darker page than I had intended. I should probably have avoided the red orange, maybe put it on after the yellow if I was determined to keep it lighter. More yellow probably would not have hurt at this stage, or more something, though I had been trying to use less since my tendency is to use a little too much sometimes. I've been seeing people using very thin layers, and I was trying to do a thinner layer to see if it worked as well for me as it did for them. It did not, and when I could see I was having a significant problem at one of the corners, I added some matte medium as the paper was peeling off the paint, and then let that corner dry before I tried to pull the sheet. My pull layer had not been thick enough for what I already had down on the plate. This was not a good pull. This was not a clean pull. This was not quick or easy. There were many stops and starts. But outside of the spots that stuck to the plate, this is a really interesting look. And I would try something similar again. Moving on to collage paper number 81 and the final for week 12. I stuck with the large gel plate for some more texture play. Sticking with the week's color palette, well, including the changed in brilliant yellow green that I hadn't actually used yet, and I am using some Hooker's Green Hue Permanent to make it look more green, to give it some differentiation from the yellow. They're very close together in color. It's also one more paper with my artificial flower, which has held up quite well and has performed better than I expected it to. Again, I wasn't totally sure how I was laying things out, but I was using green as a natural leafy color to go with my flowers. It can be a bit fussy trying to make sure that each section of petal has touched the paint sufficiently enough to pull the right amount off. I wasn't sure what texture I was going to do and decided to use some of my hot glue masks. Again, I will post a link to the video in which I made those. Actually, it's the same as the texture plate video. I didn't really want them to look like flowers. I just thought they had interesting organic lines to go along with my flowers. I had accidentally put the first one on not smooth side down, so I went back over that area and just basically tried to fill in any place that looked too smoothly green. After everything was dry, I started to apply my floral colors, at least my floral colors from this week, to my plate, being cautious of how much orange I applied. I'm finding that my smallest sprayer is very good for spreading out those edges that I hate to see and gives me a little more control with areas of color. After the orange, the yellow, not as cautious with the yellow, and with the way I'm applying the color this time, I didn't feel the need to clean off the brayer, and as small as an amount as there was on it, it wasn't going to overwhelm the yellow anyway. So I apparently also did not internalize the lesson of the amount of paint I used for my pull layer on the previous pull, and went a little light this time also. Trying to do some more smoothing with the larger brayer had taken off even more paint. I did recognize that that was not enough. I let it dry, but when I applied the matte medium, I seriously underapplied it. Because again, I usually over apply it, and then when I apply the paper, sometimes it slips. And then it takes a significant amount of drying time also. I realized my error and tried to rectify it on this half of the sheet. And beyond, I can be stubborn. And I both wanted to see how this would look and try to save it. I didn't want it to go to waste. The start of the pull was rough, and the entire pull was rough, and not a good pull, and the least complete pull I've had during this 100 collage papers. But again, I've learned, and what I was able to save looks pretty cool. So not only will I better remember to use more paint in my pull layer, I see a fun way to create texture with both my artificial flower and the masks I made. I hope you have enjoyed this week's My 100 Collage Papers wrap-up, and that you are feeling inspired to create some of your own art. Give me a thumbs up if you are feeling creative. Share with someone else who could use some inspiration. And if you haven't yet, be sure to subscribe. I will be back next week with another wrap-up video. 19 more daily collage papers and weekly small art prompts on Sundays. Because we are better with art.